Icy, snowy conditions that cause cars to crash into each other. Is that an emergency condition, or is that just lousy driving? Well, that takes us to this week's case. Involves a real case. Arose in Colorado. And there was a guy who's driving down the highway, and he suddenly encounters a very icy condition on the roadway. His car skids, slides across the center line. Bam! He slams into an oncoming car. The people in the oncoming car suffered injuries, and they sued the guy that was driving. Okay. Case goes forward. Case goes forward. The fella that hit the icy condition said, you know what? I'm not at fault. I'm not at fault. This is an emergency situation. And when you confront an emergency situation, sometimes you don't act quite as prudently, as reasonably as you might otherwise act, because you got to make a snap decision, and therefore you can't be held to the same standard of care. And that's basically what the emergency doctrine provides, that if somebody confronts an emergency situation, they can't be held to the same standard of care as somebody who's going about life and encountering normal situations. All right. The folks on the other side, however, said, you know what? You are at fault. You are at fault. Why? Because icy, snowy conditions. Hey, this is Colorado. It snows here. It gets icy. You know, the roads get slippery. Therefore, that's not an emergency situation. That's in a situation that you can anticipate, and you just were doing a lousy job of driving. Well, the case went up on appeal, went up to the Colorado Supreme Court. And there, the Colorado Supreme Court listened to both arguments. They looked at this and they said, you know what? Here in Colorado, we've had this emergency doctrine for some period of time. But I think, as in all situations, we need to examine it on a routine basis. And here was a case that causes us to examine the emergency situation doctrine, especially as it applied in this instance. And as we look at the facts here at the Colorado Supreme Court, we find that, in fact, the people that suffered the injury are right. Snowy, icy conditions here in Colorado are to be anticipated. It's not an emergency situation. It's a situation that frequently occurs on the highways of Colorado, and therefore someone driving needs to exercise extreme caution, especially when they come upon what appears to be an icy stretch of roadway. Accordingly, we find that in this instance, the emergency situation doctrine does not apply. Does not apply. They went on a little further, and they said, for all intents and purposes, we think the emergency situation doctrine causes too much problems here in Colorado, causes too many problems. Why? Because we have a comparative negligence situation where essentially the fault of two drivers is compared. And if someone suffers injury, suffers all kinds of harm, their fault is considered along with the fault of the person that might be primarily at fault. And then you kind of basically apportion the fault. And the person that may have suffered some of the harm might not get 100% of reimbursement for their harm because they are partially at fault. And we start throwing in this emergency doctrine situation, that really confuses it, and accordingly the court went on and they said, henceforth here in Colorado there will not be any instructions on the emergency doctrine, which means that the juries won't hear about it and people won't essentially be able to argue it. Technically they can still argue it, but the juries won't be instructed on it. So what do we learn from this? Well, we learn several things. We learn the manner in which the emergency situation doctrine can be applied to the specific facts, and the facts will always control, and they are dependent upon what is normally the circumstances in the time and place where the crash occurred or whatever else took place occurred. And we also see that the law changes, it morphs, it moves, and it does so based upon experiences, based upon circumstances. And here we saw the Colorado Supreme Court make a major change, not allowing a jury to be instructed any longer in Colorado on the emergency doctrine. And accordingly, it is, for all intents and purposes, no longer existing in the state of Colorado. Very important, very important. So, these are the lessons we learn. And you know what? Every week we learn lessons from cases, because every week we see cases coming down in which the law changes, in which the existing law is applied in maybe a little bit of a different manner. And in so looking at these cases, you get to find out how the law really works. I'm David Allen.